I woke up to the rumble of concrete trucks pouring into my father's creek, and in that moment, something inside me broke. This wasn't just a stream, it was the place where my dad had taught me to fish, where nearly every cherished memory of him lived. Within half an hour, my garage was underwater, and more than $45,000 worth of equipment my father left behind was ruined. When I confronted the HOA president, Diane Carter, she looked me straight in the eyes and said, "So a few old cars got wet. That's hardly a disaster. People who work with their hands should live somewhere they can afford flooding." That was her biggest mistake. She had no idea about the secret I kept tucked away in my toolbox, something that could bring her entire empire crashing down. My revenge would be flawless. But let me back up and explain how this nightmare began. It was a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise, when the ground shook with the noise of heavy machinery. I stumbled outside in my pajamas, assuming the city was finally fixing the pothole down the street. Instead, I was met with the sight of 3 massive concrete trucks lined along my property, and a crew actively dumping cement into the creek behind my house. This wasn't just any creek. It was the same one where my dad taught me to cast a line, the place I'd spent the last 15 years restoring classic cars, the foundation of my life. I stood frozen, watching them turn a living waterway into a lifeless concrete ditch. The foreman barely acknowledged me, just shrugged and pointed toward a woman in a designer suit barking orders at Diane Carter. By the time half an hour passed, the natural flow of water that had likely run for centuries was blocked. The only place for it to go was straight into my garage. Within minutes, water seeped under my garage door. I scrambled to move decades of tools and equipment out of harm's way. But there's only so much one person can do against rising water. My father's 1967 Mustang, a car he spent 3 years restoring before he passed away, was sitting in 4 inches of muddy water. The engine was destroyed, the interior ruined, and I could almost feel my heart shatter. The damages were staggering. $15,000 for the Mustang, $20,000 in specialized automotive equipment that couldn't survive submersion, $10,000 in restoration projects I was working on for clients. My livelihood was wiped out in a single morning. But the worst part wasn't the damage. It was the way the system failed me. My insurance company called it an act of God and refused to cover it. The police told me it was a civil dispute. The city said I could file a complaint, but it would take 6 months to investigate. 6 months. By then, I'd have lost everything. And then came the moment I'll never forget. Diane Carter herself strolled up to the property line in her high heels, glanced at the flooded garage, and said, "Some old cars got wet. Hardly catastrophic, hardly catastrophic." I was staring at my father's legacy floating in dirty water, and she treated it like it was nothing more than a landscaping inconvenience. Then she claimed she had all the proper permits and there was nothing I could do. When I told her that ordinary working people can't absorb a $45,000 loss, she smirked and said, "Well, maybe people like you should live where you can afford flooding." Her arrogance was unbelievable. Now, here's where I made my first move. Instead of exploding with rage, I acted clueless. I told her I was just a mechanic and didn't understand legal stuff. I let her think I was harmless. She looked smug, convinced I was an easy target. Exactly what I wanted. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that I hadn't always been a mechanic. Hidden deep in my toolbox, under years of grease-stained rags and old catalogs, was my engineering degree. 2 decades ago, I designed water management systems for cities before I took over my father's garage. That knowledge was about to become my weapon. But first, I had to survive the fallout. My insurance rates doubled overnight, word spread about my flood-prone garage, and 3 major projects were cancelled. I was falling behind on my mortgage, my health was deteriorating, and I could barely sleep. Every time I stepped into my garage, I was forced to relive what Diane had taken from me. Still, I kept digging, and what I uncovered about her made my blood run cold. A quick search of her name revealed a trail of fraud and scams. She had fled Arizona under the shadow of $2 million in fraud charges. Dozens of families had lost their life savings to her schemes. She built a career on targeting small communities, setting up shady developments, and vanishing before justice caught up. This wasn't about landscaping. This was about another con job. And I was determined to stop her. So, while she strutted around inspecting the neighborhood that afternoon, I accidentally diverted a bit of creek overflow into her BMW parked in the driveway. By the time she discovered it, her engine was completely flooded. She stormed at me, accusing me of sabotage, and I simply shrugged. The creek's unpredictable since you blocked it. The look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She was used to crushing people who couldn't fight back. But she had picked the wrong person this time. That night, standing in my ruined garage, I held my dad's old fishing rod and made a promise. He always taught me that patience beats brute force, that intelligence wins over arrogance. And now, it was my turn to be patient, to be smart, and to teach Diane Carter exactly who she was dealing with. I reached into my toolbox and pulled out that engineering degree, untouched for 20 years. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But just as I made up my mind, my phone buzzed. It was a number I had saved under emergency only a do not use. My finger hovered over the call button, wondering if it was finally time to unleash the nuclear option I'd been holding on to for years. What was this mysterious contact, and why had I been so afraid to use it? I didn't call that emergency contact a not yet. Instead, I decided to rely on some old-fashioned detective work, and what I uncovered about Diane Carter made the situation far more fascinating than I expected. See, when you're up against someone like her, you can't just charge in blindly. You have to be sharper, more deliberate. You have to find the cracks in their armor and pry them open one at a time. And fortunately for me, Diane had more weak spots than a glass house in a hailstorm. My first focus was the construction crew. I spent the morning observing, and it was obvious something was off. The foreman, a guy named Mike Valdez, looked constantly on edge, glancing at his phone, bickering with workers about safety measures, and generally carrying the air of a man under pressure. During their lunch break, I wandered over with a couple of beers, acting casual. "Big project you've got here," I said. Mike gave a weary laugh without meeting my eyes. "Yeah, broken bar. Sometimes you take jobs you probably shouldn't." That was all I needed to hear. Later that afternoon, I dug into public records and anything I could find online. What I discovered painted a very different picture of Mike, a single father of a 12-year-old girl in need of heart surgery that would cost $15,000. He had a fundraising page online, practically begging strangers for help. This wasn't a bad man, just a desperate one, and desperate people sometimes make choices they'd normally avoid. Even worse, I learned Diane had been using intimidation against him. Mike was a legal U.S. citizen, born in California, yet she had been threatening him with false immigration reports, a classic fear tactics from someone who had no ethical boundaries. That evening, I approached him directly. I showed him the articles about Diane's $2 million fraud case in Arizona. I could see the color drain from his face as the reality sank in. "I know this project is illegal," I told him plainly. "I know you need the paycheck for your daughter's surgery, but when this blows up and it will, you're going to be the one holding the blame." I could see the war inside him, torn between protecting his family and doing what was right. So I made him an offer. "Help me document what's really happening here, and I'll make sure your daughter gets that surgery." I wasn't bluffing. I had savings set aside, and nothing motivates me more than helping a kid in need. His eyes welled up as the possibility sank in. "Finally," he whispered, "what do you need me to do?" And just like that, I had an inside man. Over the next few days, Mike recorded everything, and what he captured was explosive. Audio of Diane ordering workers to skip safety checks, a recording of her offering the city inspector a $10,000 bribe, paperwork proving she had to sell 12 houses in under 3 weeks or face foreclosure. She was cutting every corner imaginable because her empire was on the verge of collapse. But the most shocking revelation? Mike uncovered proof that Diane was planning to sell every single property that weekend and vanished to Mexico on Monday, leaving 12 families bankrupt in her wake. Meanwhile, I was carrying out my own form of payback. She'd cost me $45,000, so I figured it was only fair to return the pain, dollar for dollar. Her first real blow came during a flashy investor presentation. I knew the community center's conference room had faulty wiring. With a few coincidental adjustments, the entire system shut down mid-pitch. Lights out, projector dead, and her carefully polished presentation went up in smoke. The investors yanked their $30,000 commitment instantly. That was the first domino. Of course, I was still drowning in my own losses. $8,000 to pump water from my garage, $12,000 lost in canceled restoration jobs, and the creeping rumor that maybe I wasn't as good at my craft as people thought. The whispers hurt. The stress was shredding me apart. 3 hours of sleep a night, trembling hands, 15 pounds gone from my frame. But every dollar I lost only made me more determined to make sure she lost 10. And it turned out I wasn't alone. Families in the neighborhood began approaching me with their own horror stories. Diane had been weaponizing the HOA for years, using it as her personal piggy bank and intimidation machine. Mrs. Rodriguez, down the street, was fined $500 because her mailbox was painted the wrong shade of beige. An elderly couple next door was slapped with a $1,000 penalty for excessive bird feeding. None of these were real violations. They were targeted financial shakedowns designed to funnel money into Diane's crumbling development. So I hit her again. I learned she had a critical bank meeting to request an extension on her loan. Conveniently, her luxury car was towed for a parking violation just before the meeting. She missed the appointment entirely and had to fork over $500 in fees. I watched from my garage as she exploded at the tow truck driver, unraveling in public. She was cracking. Then Mike delivered the smoking gun. He caught her bragging on tape about pulling the same scams in 3 different states. She laughed about how small-town idiots never noticed the illegal construction tricks. She even gloated about the Arizona families she ruined, saying they deserved it for being so gullible. This wasn't just corruption, this was sociopathy. She didn't just scam people, she enjoyed it. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed: financial records of her fraud, audio recordings of her bribery, documents proving the construction was illegal, a timeline showing her plan to vanish across the border. And as if fate was lending me a hand, the weather forecast showed a major storm system rolling in. 10 days. That's how long until the storm system rolled in at a perfect moment for nature itself to expose Diane's illegal construction for what it really was. I was busy organizing all the evidence when Mike called me late one night, his voice low and trembling. On a broken bar. There's something else, he whispered. Something I found in Diane's office. But if I tell you, we might end up like the last person who tried to cross her. The last person. My stomach dropped. We met that night in the dimly lit parking lot of a 24-hour diner, 10 miles out of town. Mike was a wreck, constantly scanning the shadows, flinching at every sound. When he finally handed me what he'd discovered, I understood his fear. It was an old newspaper clipping from Nevada, 3 years earlier. The headline read, "Local contractor dies in apparent accident during fraud investigation." The name? Robert Torres, Mike's older brother. "She killed my brother," Mike said, barely above a whisper. Rob worked for her, just like me. He uncovered the fake permits, the illegal builds, all of it. He was ready to go public. Then one night his truck lost control in the rain and went over a mountain road. But Rob was the best driver I knew. No way that was an accident. The puzzle pieces snapped together into a far darker picture. Diane Carter wasn't just a fraud. She might be a killer. And Mike had carried that secret for 3 years, forced to work for her because his daughter's surgery meant he had no choice. That's when I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. I stopped hiding. The very next day, I walked into Diane's office and asked for a neighborly conversation. She agreed, probably thinking she could bully me again. What she didn't expect was for me to drop a 47-page professional engineering report on her desk. "Actually, Diane," I said, pulling out my professional license, "I'm not just a mechanic, I'm a licensed hydraulic engineer. I designed drainage systems for 3 counties before I took over my father's shop." Her face drained of color. For the first time, she realized the man she thought was just a grease monkey was actually an expert who could bury her with facts. I spread out the flood maps, soil studies, and water flow models I'd prepared. Every single one of these 12 houses will be underwater when the storm hits, at least 4 feet of standing water. And according to the forecast, that's in exactly 72 hours. Anyone living here will be in danger of drowning if they don't evacuate. The balance of power shifted instantly. She tried to counter with bluster, threatening lawsuits, claiming she had friends in city planning, even taunting me about my finances. At one point she sneered that I was hiding behind my father's legacy and that he'd be ashamed of me. But none of it landed. I had something she didn't: hard science, proof her development was a death trap, and evidence she knew it all along. Meanwhile, Mike's world was changing too. The fundraiser for his daughter had hit its $15,000 goal, freeing him from Diane's financial chokehold, and with that burden lifted, he found the courage his brother never got the chance to show. He handed me recordings of Diane ordering forged documents, directing bribery attempts, and, most damning of all, planning to sell every house to unsuspecting families before vanishing. Now he was ready to risk everything to save his community and honor his brother. My next strike was precise. Diane had lined up a private investor from Los Angeles willing to buy all 12 houses for $400,000. I contacted him, offering a free consultation as a licensed engineer. Once I walked him through the flood reports and soil analysis, he walked away without hesitation. Just like that, Diane's $400,000 lifeline evaporated. And I wasn't done. I reached out to 3 different local news stations, pitching them the story of a massive fraud scandal brewing in our community. They all agreed to cover it, but I told them to hold off until the storm. I wanted cameras rolling when the water hit those homes exactly as I predicted. It would be the perfect narrative. Science versus greed. A small town fight against corruption. David versus Goliath. Predictably, Diane lashed out. She filed for restraining orders, accused me of harassment, painted me as an unstable mechanic obsessed with stopping progress. She even pulled political strings to get city officials sniffing around my business, trying to paint me as the villain. But every move she made only created more evidence of her corruption and desperation. And while she scrambled, something incredible happened. The community rose up. 30 families came forward to back me, each with their own stories and documents, proof that they'd been harassed, fined, and bullied by Diane for years. Diane's harassment tactics were no longer just a whispered story, they were being documented by dozens of families. Together, we had built a small but determined neighborhood coalition, a united front that refused to be intimidated anymore. Legal help began to fall into place as well. Neighbors pooled their resources, raising enough to retain attorneys. Even if criminal charges didn't immediately land, the civil case alone would financially crush her empire. My 5th strike against her wasn't physical, it was psychological. During one of her routine site inspections, I casually dropped a bombshell. I knew about her $800,000 debt and the looming 72-hour foreclosure deadline. The way her face twisted in shock was unforgettable. "How do you know that?" she snapped. "Because I've been watching everything," I answered evenly. "Every deal you've made, every desperate move, every buried document. You're not nearly as invisible as you think." That single exchange shattered something inside her. For the first time, she realized I wasn't just a nuisance. I was an enemy who had been quietly tracking her every step. With less than 2 days before the storm, everything aligned. The press was primed for live coverage. The neighborhood had organized into a formidable force, armed with files and testimonies. And I had a 200-page engineering dossier ready to reveal every corner of her corruption. Then came the twist. As I reviewed the latest weather radar, my software delivered a gut-wrenching update. My flood models had been wrong, but not in the way people feared. The storm wasn't going to be deadlier than I predicted. In fact, it was shaping up to be weaker. Weaker meant less damage, less drama, and just enough wiggle room for Diane to dismiss the whole thing as a little rain. I faced a choice: let her escape with a watered-down disaster or take bold action to make sure her crimes were exposed. I chose the latter. At dawn, I picked up the phone. "This is Ethan Morrison, licensed hydraulic engineer," I told every news station in the region. "In just a few hours, 12 homes built illegally in a flood zone are going to fail. The president of the HOA is behind it all." My tone was firm, confident, undeniable. Within an hour, 3 stations had agreed to cover it live. By sunrise, camera crews were setting up at the best angles around the development. I briefed reporters like a field commander. "When water levels hit 12 inches, these foundations won't hold," I explained. showing maps and diagrams. The developer knew this would happen. As the rain thickened, my predictions began unfolding on camera in real time. At 8:45, the first house cornered by runoff water began to show stress exactly where I had said it would. By 9 o'clock, the flood was undeniable, captured for thousands of viewers. Anchors turned to me for live commentary, and I explained with calm precision why this was happening, weaving decades of expertise into every sentence. And then came the dramatic crescendo. Diane herself stormed onto the scene, designer shoes sinking in knee-deep water, trying desperately to spin the disaster while her fraudulent empire literally crumbled behind her. The Channel 7 reporter didn't hesitate. "Ms. Carter, Mr. Morrison warned about this 3 months ago. Why did you ignore his report?" Her answer was as flimsy as her construction. "This is an unprecedented storm. No one could have predicted this." But I was standing right beside her, holding the documented engineering report that proved otherwise. That's when Mike stepped forward, calm but shaking with emotion. He held up his phone and pressed play. Clear as day, Diane's voice came out of the speaker ordering illegal builds, pressuring workers to cut corners, threatening anyone who resisted. "She forced me to build without permits," Mike declared to the live cameras. "She threatened my family when I tried to stop her." She knew exactly what was coming. Mike's confession was the final nail in Diane's coffin. On live television, he admitted that she had ordered him to cut corners, that she knew exactly what would happen, and that she ignored every warning I gave her. The moment he spoke, you could feel the air shift. A man who had lived in fear was finally brave enough to tell the truth. The response from authorities was immediate. Within 2 hours, FBI agents arrived on site. I personally handed them the 3 weeks of evidence I had compiled of financial records, engineering reports, audio recordings, sworn statements, everything they needed. They didn't waste time. In front of rolling cameras, Diane Carter was arrested in handcuffs, standing in the very floodwaters she created. That image spread across the internet like wildfire. The fallout was swift. 12 families were safely evacuated and no injuries, thanks to the warnings we issued in advance. All construction on the development was halted, every permit suspended pending federal review. The FBI froze her accounts and seized her assets to repay victims. By that evening, the story was no longer local, it had gone national. During interviews, I made sure the narrative was clear. For 3 months, I investigated this fraud myself. My engineering expertise allowed me to predict exactly what would happen when no one else would listen. So I gathered the evidence and protected this community. It worked. The press framed it as one man's knowledge and persistence saving dozens of families from disaster. Clips of Diane being arrested were shared millions of times within hours. My on-camera predictions, proven accurate down to the minute, became a viral symbol of science exposing corruption. Neighbors cheering and thanking me were broadcast everywhere. A grassroots victory, David versus Goliath, community versus greed. But just as I was enjoying that hard-won victory, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You think you won? Check your garage. You have 1 hour." I rushed home. What I found didn't make sense. My garage completely empty. Every tool, every car, every piece of equipment gone. No broken locks, no tire tracks, no security footage. It was as if my entire livelihood had been erased. The police were baffled. Neighbors hadn't seen a thing. How could someone clear out an entire workshop in broad daylight while I was live on television just blocks away? And more importantly, who had the power and resources to do it? That night, the phone rang again, another unknown number. The voice was calm, professional, almost polite, and far more chilling than anger ever could be. "Mr. Morrison, you've disrupted some very important business interests. We trust you'll be more careful with your investigations moving forward." Then the line went dead. I stood in that empty garage, realizing this wasn't just about Diane anymore. I had stumbled into something much larger. Fear gave way to something sharper: rage. These people had stolen my livelihood, violated my home, and threatened my safety, all because I used science and the law to protect my community. If they thought that would make me back down, they had no idea who they were dealing with. That night, I began making calls to law enforcement contacts, fellow engineers, investigative journalists. If they wanted a war, I was ready to fight one. The FBI's case against Diane snowballed. Within 3 days, investigators traced her finances to a sprawling network of fraud across multiple states. Arizona reopened its case. Nevada followed. Colorado and New Mexico turned up evidence as well. Diane Carter wasn't just a rogue operator, she was part of a coordinated ring siphoning millions through illegal developments for over a decade. The breakthrough came when the FBI linked the burglary of my garage to the wider conspiracy. That theft wasn't random, it was part of something much bigger. The people who cleaned out my garage were in tandem thieves. They were tied to the same criminal network that shielded Diane's operations for years. Intimidation, theft, and silent threats were their standard tools to keep potential whistleblowers quiet. That phone call I received wasn't just menacing, it was proof of federal witness intimidation, a serious crime carrying heavy prison time. Overnight, I went from being harassed by an HOA to standing as a federal witness in a major organized crime case. Media coverage exploded. News outlets across the country branded my investigation as the engineering inquiry that toppled a multi-million-dollar fraud ring. I found myself on primetime interviews, explaining how simple scientific reasoning and grassroots organizing had exposed a conspiracy law enforcement had been struggling to nail down for years. The narrative captured imaginations everywhere. One man's knowledge and persistence had not only saved his own neighborhood but had triggered the collapse of a criminal empire. 2 weeks later, the first signs of recovery appeared. FBI raids on storage facilities uncovered millions of dollars in stolen property of vehicles, tools, and equipment linked to dozens of victims across multiple states. Among them was my father's Mustang, dusty but intact, sitting in a warehouse in Nevada alongside most of my classic cars and professional gear. Restoring everything would be costly, but now that it was officially theft recovery instead of flood loss, insurance and federal victim compensation funds stepped in to cover it all. Meanwhile, Diane Carter's downfall was complete. She faced an avalanche of federal charges: wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, environmental violations, and witness intimidation alongside state charges for bribery, fraud, and building code corruption. With her ties to the broader network exposed, there was no chance of bail or plea deals. The judge handed down 12 years behind bars, federal and state sentences stacked consecutively. He condemned her specifically for preying on working-class families, calling her crimes particularly cruel. For me, the vindication was overwhelming. The state's engineering society honored me with their Lifetime Achievement Award for using technical expertise to defend communities from corruption. Universities began inviting me to lecture on engineering ethics. High-value consulting work poured in, contracts worth hundreds of thousands annually, helping other towns detect and stop similar schemes. Within my profession, I was no longer just a mechanic or engineer. I was being held up as an example of how technical skill could serve the public good. Even more inspiring was the transformation of Mike Valdez. His cooperation deal protected him from prosecution, and his testimony proved vital in securing convictions across the network. Soon after, he was hired as the county's chief building inspector, tasked with implementing fraud detection safeguards. His daughter's surgery was fully funded by the Victim Compensation Program, and she flourished in school. Mike's reputation shifted dramatically. He became respected as the man who risked everything to do what was right. The neighborhood itself rebounded beautifully. Federal emergency aid funded a $2 million project to restore the creek, returning it to its natural flow and boosting property values. The redevelopment that followed was done correctly this time, with my firm overseeing flood management and safety standards. Our community became a model for grassroots oversight, one that other neighborhoods soon began copying. Financial justice was just as significant. The courts ordered $2.1 million in restitution from the criminal network, ensuring every affected family was compensated. I received a $200,000 settlement from the city for failing to properly monitor permits. Mike was awarded $50,000 as a federal whistleblower reward, and the Community Legal Victory Fund we established gained over $300,000 to help other neighborhoods battle similar fraud. But the real legacy lay in the systemic reforms. State lawmakers passed the Morrison Creek Act, mandating licensed engineering approval for any project in flood-prone zones. County oversight was tightened to block fraudulent applications. Courts set new precedent empowering citizen groups to uncover and prosecute development fraud. And professional engineering standards were updated to enforce stronger ethical requirements for builders and contractors. Most meaningful to me, though, was honoring my father's values. The creek he loved now flowed clean and protected for future generations. My garage was rebuilt better equipped than before, supporting both my restoration business and my consulting practice. My reputation had evolved from neighborhood mechanic to regional engineer advocate, attracting clients from all over. Above all, I had fulfilled the principle my father taught me: engineering exists to protect people. The ripple effects kept spreading long after. Our case became a staple in university ethics courses. Federal agencies consulted me on fraud prevention. Media outlets highlighted the story as proof that knowledge and community organizing could overcome corruption. Even international organizations studied our model for defending communities against predatory development. What began as a 3-week fight against Diane Carter had grown into a national movement for accountability and community resilience. Just when I thought the saga had reached its end, when I had finally settled into my new life as a community advocate and respected engineering consultant, another twist hit me harder than anything before. I was midway through a keynote at a national engineering conference when Agent Morrison from the FBI intercepted me during the break. His face was grave. "Mr. Morrison, we need to speak privately," he said. I followed him into a secured conference room where 3 other agents were waiting. Laptops and thick files spread across the table. The tension in the room made my stomach drop. "Ethan," the lead agent began, "we need to talk about your father, David Morrison, or rather a broken bar David Blackwater. We know he changed his identity in 1978 and we need to tell you why." The world seemed to tilt. My father, the man who drilled honesty and integrity into me, had lived under a false name. The story they revealed was staggering. My father hadn't been just another engineer. He had once been a federal whistleblower who exposed one of the largest government land and water scandals of the 1970s. His testimony toppled 3 U.S. senators and a federal judge, but it also put his life in jeopardy. To survive, he was placed in witness protection, given a new identity, and hidden away in our quiet community. Every story I thought I knew about my family, the neat little history I'd grown up with, was a carefully constructed cover. Agent Morrison leaned forward. "Your instincts, your eye for fraud, your investigative drive, a broken bar, none of that came out of nowhere." David Blackwater was one of the sharpest forensic engineers we ever worked with. He could spot a crooked development in minutes. He traced money laundering webs that took down entire networks. Ethana, you didn't just inherit his work ethic, you inherited his gift. But then came the bombshell that made everything twist into an even darker shape. Diane Carter wasn't just a fraudster who stumbled into our community. Her true name was Diana Blackwater Clark, my father's niece. For over 2 decades, she had been hunting him, desperate to silence the last living witness who could tie her criminal syndicate to the original government corruption scandal. When she discovered David Morrison was actually her uncle David Blackwater, she had plotted to eliminate him and anyone protecting him. My father's sudden death from a heart attack 3 years earlier had spared him from her reach. In a grim way, it had spared me, too. And the scope of the network I had uncovered, it was far larger than shady HOA deals. The group had its roots in the same operation my father had once exposed, an organization that had been systematically stealing Native American water rights for decades, reselling them to corporations for billions. Diane's developments were money laundering fronts, fueling political corruption that kept the theft alive. My so-called small-town investigation had ripped the lid off a conspiracy stretching back 40 years, implicating politicians, judges, and corporate executives across multiple states. Then Morrison revealed something that nearly floored me. My father had left behind boxes of meticulous records, engineering reports, financial forensics, and sworn witness statements. For 20 years, while in hiding, he had quietly built an airtight case, waiting for the day it could be used safely. He never got that chance. But now, paired with my investigation, His work was enough to dismantle the entire machine. The government moved quickly. I was asked to serve as their chief technical consultant on water rights fraud, working directly with the Justice Department and tribal nations. The contract was staggering, $5 million annually, but what mattered most was this: I would be continuing my father's mission, using science and law to defend vulnerable communities from exploitation. The revelation sent my story into a new orbit. Headlines called me the engineer who cracked a 40-year conspiracy. Major networks rolled out documentaries detailing how a neighborhood dispute had snowballed into the exposure of one of the largest environmental crimes in American history. Publishers offered seven-figure book deals. Universities launched new programs in engineering ethics and environmental justice, using my case as their foundation. Meanwhile, Morrison Engineering grew from a small consulting outfit into a powerhouse firm with 15 employees, specializing in fraud detection and environmental protection. We were contracting with federal agencies, state governments, and tribal authorities to uncover shady projects and stolen water rights. Our forensic methods were adopted nationwide by law enforcement. We even built training programs that certified hundreds of engineers every year in ethical oversight practices. Watching the impact of our work spread was nothing short of extraordinary. But even as victories piled up, the personal revelations kept coming. I discovered that my father had quietly established a trust fund worth more than $2 million. Built from whistleblower rewards and federal compensation he had received over the years. He had earmarked the entire sum for one purpose: continuing his mission of protecting communities and finishing the fight he had begun decades earlier. Alongside the fund were pages of detailed instructions, almost like a manual, outlining how to use his research to dismantle what remained of the criminal network. My father had, in essence, handed me a blueprint for becoming one of the country's most effective investigators of environmental crime. Our local creek restoration became a powerful symbol of what justice could look like. With federal resources, the ecosystem was fully rehabilitated, turning that once threatened waterway into a model of conservation. The Morrison Creek Environmental Learning Lab soon followed, serving as both a research hub and educational center, drawing university students from across the country to study watershed protection and environmental law. Visitors from around the world began traveling to see the place where one engineer's investigation had changed everything. Seeing my community transform was remarkable, but so were the changes in the people I had fought beside. Mike Valdez's rise was one of the most inspiring parts of the journey. From a frightened contractor, he had become a respected fraud investigator at the state level, one of the youngest senior specialists in the nation. His family was thriving. His daughter, excelling in school, was now considering a career in environmental law after being inspired by our story. And Mike himself was training a new wave of construction professionals to uphold ethics and protect communities from exploitation. His transformation from vulnerable whistleblower to celebrated community leader was nothing short of beautiful. As for Diane Cartera, justice hit her harder than she ever expected. Federal prison stripped away every luxury she had grown accustomed to. Her prison work assignment paid her just 25 cents an hour, with those wages funneling directly into victim restitution. She would spend the rest of her life paying back what she had stolen. Her appeals failed at every level, and with her powerful allies exposed and prosecuted, she was utterly alone. Even behind bars, her reputation as someone who destroyed communities meant she found little sympathy among other inmates. The ripple effects of our case reshaped the entire system of environmental oversight. 12 states passed laws modeled after the Morrison Creek Act, mandating independent engineering reviews for all major development projects. The Department of Justice created a specialized environmental crime task force patterned after our work. Courts across the country began citing our case as precedent, showing how communities could rise up and hold corporations accountable. A new era of environmental justice was taking root, one that placed science and community expertise above corporate influence. But just as I was settling into my new role as a national authority on environmental crime, preparing to testify before Congress on water rights reform, just when I felt I had finally found my purpose, something happened that shook my entire identity. At the White House, I was accepting the Presidential Environmental Justice Award before an audience of leaders, cameras, and dignitaries. The moment was surreal until a woman suddenly stood up in the crowd and shouted words that froze me where I stood. "Stop! That man is not who he says he is." Secret Service moved quickly toward her, but she kept shouting, "I am David Morrison's real daughter and I can prove he stole my father's identity." The room erupted in chaos. The president halted mid-sentence. Cameras pivoted toward her. Every eye was on me. She was relentless. "This man has been living my father's life for 30 years. I have DNA evidence, birth certificates, everything." Shockwaves rippled through the audience. My mind spun wildly. If there was one thing I had always been certain of, it was who my father was. But in the ornate White House chamber, clutching an award I believed I had earned, I realized certainty might be the most dangerous illusion of all. Agent Morrison, who had accompanied me to the ceremony, stepped forward with a look that mixed apology and inevitability. "Ma'am," he said firmly to the woman, "you need to come with us right now." Then he turned to me, his eyes heavy. "On a broken bar, there's something about your father's witness protection that we never told you, something we weren't sure you were ready to hear." The ceremony was abruptly stopped. The president was escorted out. I was taken into a secure White House conference room, where truths I thought I had finally pieced together were about to be broken apart again. It felt like I had reached the bottom of the mystery only to find another hidden level waiting beneath. The truth was more astonishing than anything I'd heard before. My father was David Morrison, but only in name. The identity itself had once belonged to a young engineer who died tragically in a car accident in 1978. With no surviving family, he was the perfect cover for a federal witness who needed to vanish completely. The man I knew as my father, David Blackwater, had been given that name, complete with a fabricated backstory, professional credentials, and even a fictionalized childhood history. And I had grown up believing every detail was real. Every story my dad had ever shared of his days at engineering school, his first job, even the fishing trips he swore were his favorites, turned out to be part of a carefully constructed backstory created by federal agents. It wasn't just about protecting him, it was about protecting all of us from the people who wanted him silenced forever. The woman who interrupted the ceremony was Jennifer Morrison, the biological daughter of the man whose identity my father had assumed. For 3 decades, she had been searching for answers about her father's mysterious death, never realizing that someone else had been living under his name in a small town far away. Agents explained that she had recently uncovered DNA proof showing that the man buried under her father's name wasn't really him. Her search for truth eventually led her straight into the same criminal network that had destroyed both of our families. She had noticed the details in my public story projects, technical specialties, even career historia that matched exactly with her father's real background. That's when things became even more shocking. Jennifer discovered that her father's accident in 1978 wasn't an accident at all. He had uncovered the same water rights corruption that my father was secretly fighting, and the network had him killed to keep their scheme buried. Ironically, the government later used his stolen identity to hide their star witness and my father, David Blackwater. 2 families, devastated by the same ruthless criminals decades apart, unknowingly fighting the same battle. Meeting Jennifer was awkward in ways I can hardly explain. What do you say to the daughter of the man whose identity your father lived under for 30 years? But it also created an opportunity we never expected. She had spent 3 decades collecting evidence about her father's murder, and her files meshed perfectly with the research my father had left behind. Together, we had enough to expose the conspiracy in full and finally take down the people who had been stealing Native American water rights and eliminating witnesses for over 40 years. Legally, the implications were enormous. The murder of the real David Morrison was still within federal prosecution limits, especially since corruption had prevented an investigation at the time. With Jennifer's evidence and my father's protection records, prosecutors had the ammunition to indict senators, federal judges, and corporate executives for conspiracy, murder, and environmental crimes stretching back to the 1970s. On a personal level, I wrestled with my own identity. DNA testing confirmed I was indeed the son of David Blackwater, making me the rightful heir to his mission and research. But I was also the son of a man who had lived under another man's name. The government offered to legally restore my father's original identity or let me continue using the Morrison name, which had become a symbol of environmental justice. I chose both, becoming Ethan Blackwater Morrison, because each name represented a part of who I was. Jennifer and I formed an unlikely alliance, one that became one of the strongest forces for environmental justice in the country. With her investigative skills and my engineering background and federal ties, we launched the Morrison Blackwater Foundation. Using my father's trust fund and government compensation money, we built a $12 million organization in its first year, staffed with lawyers, engineers, and investigators to pursue environmental criminals nationwide. The results were groundbreaking. Congressional hearings revealed the massive water rights conspiracy, leading to legislation that restored millions of acres to tribal nations and delivered restitution to communities robbed for generations. Executives and politicians faced trials, convictions, and even life sentences for their roles in murders and cover-ups. Over $8 billion in compensation was returned, marking one of the largest environmental justice settlements in U.S. history. My role expanded beyond anything I could have imagined. I was testifying before Congress, consulting with international organizations, and helping draft anti-fraud frameworks adopted by more than 50 countries. The Morrison engineering firm grew into a multinational powerhouse with hundreds of employees dedicated to environmental crime investigation. Our training programs reshaped law enforcement's ability to detect and stop fraud before it devastated communities. But the greatest pride I carried came from the grassroots impact. The Morrison Creek model was being replicated across the nation, empowering communities with science and law to defend themselves. Educational initiatives inspired young people to become advocates for justice, and our scholarship program helped hundreds of working-class students pursue engineering careers rooted in ethics and protection of their communities. 5 years later, I stood in the same creek where my father had once taught me to fish, now teaching my own children to cast their lines into clean waters flowing through a restored ecosystem. We had built a memorial honoring both David Blackwater and David Morrison, recognizing that identity isn't only about your name, but about the choices you make and the legacy you leave behind. Jennifer and I had expanded the foundation's reach to 6 continents, building a global shield against corporate exploitation of natural resources. For a moment, I thought the story had finally come full circle. But just as I was planning our next steps, my phone rang with a call that made my stomach drop. "Mr. Morrison, this is the UN Development Program. We need your expertise in 12 countries facing similar fraud." But there's something else. A broken bar. Diane Carter's prison cell was found empty this morning. No alarms, no forced entry, just a handwritten note on her pillow, addressed to you. How could Diane have escaped a maximum security prison? And what message had she left that could unravel everything I had worked so hard to build? And that's how a battle against a fraudulent HOA turned into a 40-year conspiracy that reshaped environmental law forever. Sometimes the system fails us, but with science, persistence, and community, even the most powerful criminals can be brought down.